Hello, 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 and welcome to hello, and welcome to and welcome to Pop Cartoon Kabala, 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 coming at you from the Ala Valley, not quite as far north as Shimon Bar Yochai's grave, but not too far from Samson's. Samson's the Great Integrator. I want to talk about Samson because I think this is part of the secret of the transition from Taurus into Gemini. Now, I'm no astrologer. I got into this astro stuff mostly as a mythographer, as someone curious about the sort of built in meaning in stories. And, trying to suss out some of the implicit and explicit patterns and notice how they've adapted. Because the fundamental theory of this whole project is that, there's good stuff out there, but there's also change. And this is part of what's being sloped and tracked by mythology, and part of what's being sloped and tracked in narrative, and part of what's being sloped and tracked in, I think, the seasonality of narrative that is inherent to I want to say integrative mythology, which I think is the tendency and grace and power of the pan-Hellenistic model, But there's a lot to criticize in it, and that criticism is what both keeps it alive, keeps it relevant, and keeps threatening it, because sometimes maybe the criticism is too big. And sometimes I wonder if the Typhon apocalypse described in some of the mythic descriptions of the development of the constellations, not all of them, but let's say like Pisces. Pisces forms an important axis in the mythological wheel, spiral, cycle. Yes, that's the word, mythological cycle, where Pisces is kind of the end of the cycle, right? Most traditional models, Pisces is the 12th month and Aries is the first. And the Hebrew astrology of the Kabbalah is just like this, the first month, even as much as Rosh Hashanah is in the 7th month. The first month is Aries, Nisan. And this itself is a sublime mystery that is very mysterious, as the nature of sublime mysteries. And closer to Aries is this window right now. But I think part of the 12 cycle is that closeness is distance. And this parallels the formation of the 12 in the Sefer Yetzirah through the 7, where it's the opposite of each of the 7 that becomes the next one. This is my read of it, right? Like Jupiter's kind of the opposite of Saturn, right? Mercury's kind of the opposite of Luna. These are not fair things to say. Mars is kind of the opposite of the sun, right? The sun is kind of the opposite of Venus. I mean, these are ridiculous, bordering on obscene generalizations, but they're also pretty accurate. Jupiter is really the opposite of Saturn, where Saturn tries to eat everything. Jupiter makes space for everything. And then the third is the one that reconciles and balances out. And this is a cosmic principle before the 7. Like the fundamental narrative in the Sefer Yetzirah, which we've described as being the fundamental text of the entire Kabbalah, and the place where, west means east and north means south, at least as far as, some traditions. The beginning of everything in this model is Aries, the ram, right? The aluf, right? In this model, let's just go with it for a second. And this is the beginning of the word as it emerges, right? The beginning of revelation in the world. See, the first that comes after the 12th is a different first than came before, but it is part of a cycle, right? Even most Passover narratives, all Passover narratives, really treated as like almost like, the first book of Exodus but after the book of Genesis is over. This is not integration, right? Cows are different from rams, and they're very much defined by their difference here, right? Like I as a kid, I really thought of them as somewhat synonymous, just different meat, right? How different are chicken from turkeys? How different is sheep from cows? But the truth is, they're very, very different, and the difference between them was such a huge part of human migration and development. They're just very different because I think fundamentally sheep are the first thing. Sheep might be equatable with goats, but not with cows, because cows really are so much more nourished in their way, and thus bigger, freer, more organized. And Taurus is in many ways. I love my Aries friends. I love the Aries in my friends, the moons. But Taurus is more powerful in a lot of ways because Taurus can't be stopped. I love my Taurus daughter, you know. Um, they're harder to stop, like a juggernaut, because just in the same way that the flocks were much more powerful when they were bigger, and this is the power of the entire cow face of Taurus, so too the power of reflection in many ways is so different than the power of innovation. And this is the core meditation of like the Sfirat HaOmer, right? The counting from Passover at the full moon of Aries until 50 days later, until I should say 7 weeks later. At the beginning of Sivan, of Gemini, and most of Sfirat HaOmer, including the range of epic holidays, secret holidays kind of included within the Omer counting, the modern nationalist Jewish holidays, Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, which made it all the way into the anarchist catalogs. Publisher Atana Media has like a calendar of Jubilee saints, of all activist saints, and they also just include whatever holiday it is. The Zionist nationalist holidays crossed over into just being Jewish holidays, at least on these maps, in much the same way that Pete Seeger treated the Israeli like Hanukkah songs as if they're just folk songs. They're just folk songs, and not part of some kind of a nationalist problem. But I think Dixie was also in some of those catalogs. I think a lot of folk songs and sort of nationalist organizing songs have a lot of crossover. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because the problem of the cow is the problem of nationalism. You can just do a lot better work with a bigger crowd. And a big crowd needs to be either a very shallow crowd motivated by, bread or whatever it is that draws a crowd, hotcakes, right? Or a very deeply invested crowd. And this is part of the recurring power and danger and power and meaning of nationalism. The recurring power and meaning of nationalism has long been acknowledged within the anarchist world, because it's hard not to notice, especially how manifest it is in our own hearts. Everyone knows, right? Early anarchism and early fascism were very bound up in the same movements in Italy. They were just liberation, for us, which is the place where nationalism includes fascism and anarchism. We don't want to have to be told what to do, so we get together with us and use the songs and signs of who we are deep down to do the thing we really do, unaccountable. And this is nationalism. And this is why nationalism is such a powerful and empowering alternative to liberalism, right? Which has a mercenary thing. Now, don't get me wrong. I appreciate liberalism and all its promises, messianic and redemptive, as well as just material and anti-messianic and anti-redemptive. Here we are. What do you need? There's great space within liberalism for even more conscious. And this is part of why liberalism winds up as a centrism, Once upon a time, liberalism would be a very bold, progressive gesture away from monarchism. And monarchism is a weird, regressive thing. Once liberalism is in charge and the future is nigh upon us, then it's like, okay, monarchists are like weird, gross, just okay, almost like nerds. Wouldn't it be great if? But nationalism swings right back towards monarchism, because who is it that tells you can do whatever you want? Whoever it is, he's hired to be my king forever. And this is the great horror in right nationalism, that we do have a little bit in left nationalism, more than a little, right? Sort of Gavin Newsom worship. Remember Obama worship, when they thought he was on their side, when we thought he was on our side, when we thought that a central figure could really solve the problem. We all just become monarchists again. Team Bernie, love to have a monarch who just believed in what we believed in and cared what we cared about. And in this way, I want to tell you guys a big secret about Gemini. It's called the twins. Gemini. But it really is just one. And this is the secret of the integration that makes Gemini powerful. And this is a secret of why the Torah is given in Sivan, but it's processed in ER. And it's really initialized in Nisan, right? The Torah, the word, comes from you, comes from your heart. The law comes from the people. And this is the thing that powers nationalism, even within a revolution, even within a progressive movement to overcome localized, self-indulgent assumptions about who we are. What we're supposed to do is, well, first start with feeding who we are. And the real American thing to do, the real Israeli thing to do, the real British thing to do is like want to be free and set other people free. So already a nationalism can be co-opted to progressive means by no true Scotsman would keep slaves. It's very easy to do, and also patently ridiculous, because the other side sees through that. They're like, no, we don't. And that's all it takes, regionally. But then the no, we don't is very regional, whereas the yes, we do can be viral. And this is part of the great phase in history where media became part of liberal centrism. Maybe fundamentally, maybe from the very beginning, maybe from the satyr plays, right? Maybe this is part of what Nietzsche is talking about in the development of theater as an alternative to religion, which is philosophy as an alternative to mythology, right? Theater is informed by a theoretical structural modality that tries to adapt the power of mystery religion and ecstatic cult into something tidier, just a sort of 3-act play and a 3-play weekend, according to a system of what time it is and what should make sense and what the new clarity that we're trying to share with the community at large is. And it's very influential. I think these are the great developments in the creation of mythology and astrology and mysticism, as that themselves sort of describe a post-apocalyptic context or pre-apocalyptic context, before things get weird or after things got weird, to hint to what the message is. And in Sivan, in Gemini, these are digested into one thing, whereas the Torah of Exodus, of Aries, is like, let my people go, the God who liberates beyond the God who makes new rules. And there are no rules in the liberation. And this is the fundamental voice of God. And this is the place where the experience of freedom in nationalism and in socialism and in anarchism and in libertarianisms all express themselves as an invitation to your true will, our true will, the true will, and freedom from the other compelling pretension at the center that, promises functionality and capacity and long future. And I think a lot of the work of the Chariot is fixing the center, fixing the God at the center, so that the extremes that become toxic give way to a flexibility and fluidity, like the images of lightning, where the different ways we are can adapt to the need for the situation effectively, helpfully, and not, methodologically, alienatedly, but also full-heartedly and presently, with wholeness, which is the main thing pop media struggles with. It's easy to make a plastic robot do plastic robot things. crossing over the conceptual uncanny valley to resonance, they're always kind of just catching the story that's popular and sort of bringing it back afterwards. That's kind of what Disney does. It's kind of what the whole general reboot factory of media does. Find what's human, resonant, touching, and just cycle it back to you with whatever the associated moral is. Whereas the tragedy of the monomyth of, the Great Divine Mother and her betrayal by Tammuz or whoever is inherently cathartic and meaningful. While you're there, might as well say, oh, the problem with Tammuz was? And then just list whatever the ungraces you're trying to offset are. And this is modern media, right? This is superhero media. This is Batman, right? The new Batman recognizes the excess of every previous version of Batman, and also the virtues, right? The virtues are capacity and the promise of taking care of stuff. The excesses are offering too much, being too much in control, and thinking cathartic violence is the whole thing. Cathartic violence is not the whole thing. And this is the thing that Dioscuri learned also. Like, what is Gemini? There were two twins. One had to die. So they didn't have to die. They integrate completely. And you have this in the most ancient version of the Babylonian one, where the two faces of Nergal, Lugal, Ira, and Meslamta, are somehow both integrated in the place where they become one together. And this is the real work of a coherent ideology and media and theater and message, philosophically or mythologically, that actually resonates. Like Israeli Independence Day, like other Independence Days, it's not quite about nationalism. 4th of July is not quite about nationalism, right? It's about leaning in to pride, whatever you can feel good about. And the nature of the May celebrations of May Day, in many ways, is a lot about, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think inherently, the nature of the Mother May, right? And her celebration at the beginning of the month, and then her sort of transition into Gemini, the worst of the patriarchs in many ways is Gemini. I don't know which sign is associated with Gemini, but I do know in some narratives it's not Castor and Pollux, it's Hercules and Apollo, right? Hercules is a hero in Marvel Comics, but a villain in DC, because DC knows how important Hippolyta is. And Marvel knows how important Hippolyta isn't. There's a bit of an inversion here in terms of romancing the villain and vilifying the romantic of Hercules and Apollo, right? The most solar heroes. So I want to talk about Samson. Samson is so much Hercules, maybe not so much Apollo. But the whole concept of Gemini is that the two are integrated into each other. Samson is a little bit anomalous in a lot of ways, right? He's not quite a prophet. He's not a king. He's a judge. He is a prophet. But more than a prophet, he's like a superhero. Identified with the lion skin that he wears. His name, Samson, Shimshon, implies the solar nature of the thing. And it's weird that the ancient Greeks felt that Apollo and Hercules are also the twins. But it says a lot about their relationship to integration and balance, right? Apollo's greatness, the sun's greatness, is the balancing force in the center. Reason, centrism. What's the greatness of all of them, right? Mainstreamedness is that they're objectively correct as much as anyone can tell or prove. And they're just full of grace. And they're great for building, these principles, great for construction. And so Shavuot in Sivan, in Gemini, is when the word comes down that resolves between the, I want to say, virtuous anarchism of Passover and the process nativist terror of Taurus. Lag BaOmer is during Taurus. I think it has a lot to do with it. Is Lag BaOmer a nationalist holiday? I've heard argue that it is. It sure does seem land-bound, based around an actual place, an actual grave. But is Shimon Bar Yochai a nationalist hero? I don't think he quite just is. I mean, I think he is like Joseph Trumpeldor is, right? The anarchists and socialists and fascists all claim him. That's the kind of hero you want. That's the kind of Batman you want, right? The anarchists, the fascists, the socialists, and the libertarians are all like, no, he's one of ours, like Esther Amalka. Shimon Bar Yochai's main criticism of Rome and of modernity, which has redemptive vibes, don't get me wrong, is they're just doing it for the money and the sex, just take advantage of you. The model is something wonderful that you can then be sold on the altar to. And this remains the standing fundamental criticism that left and right we all have of liberalism, neo-liberalism, or just the regular kind, or even the extreme, anarchist right kind of libertarianism. They just want to put your daughters on the market, right? Nationalism, conservatism, even the sort of conservative repressive tradition within socialism, even the sort of monastic tradition without anarchism, the sort of autistic mechanical tradition with anarchism, the sort of dance of listening for consent that has emerged fully formed into the center and into the true way of relating, right? These are all very much bound up in the Samson problem, right? Samson tries to integrate wider through love, through grace, through play, through war, through everything. And as much as he's defeated by it, the thing he defeats by it is just a big mess, So Samson, you could say, is a nationalist hero, although what tribe is he even from? This kind of peripheral, fallen behind tribe. That's not a huge part of the advance, but I guess it is. I guess that's part of the revelation of the thing that unifies the 12. Hercules unifies the 12 constellations under the sun. Apollo in many ways does also. And Samson unifies the whole thing in advance of the disaster of the end of Book of Judges, where there is no king and people just become worse and worse. As much as it is good not to have a king, people just become worse and worse, meaner and more insensitive, rapier than Samson. Hercules' great crime in the Wonder Woman narrative, of course, is that he is all of the masculine violence, which is reason, which comes in, steals Hippolyta's girdle through the worst betrayals. And Samson is very different in relationship to the betrayals, right? He's not making it up all the time. But enough about Shimshon, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in a way is a callback to, the tribe Shimon, sort of unchecked will to violence, but he's not a very violent figure. You'll notice he doesn't die like the rest of the people fighting against Rome. The story goes, his fundamental criticism of Rome comes up because one of the other rabbis is saying, they're not so bad. They're building us roads. They're building us markets. They're really helping to end a lot of the conflicts going on between us and our enemies. Maybe they are the redemption. Maybe Esau is the redemption. And Shimon Bar Yochai's criticism is they're just doing that so they can take our kids in captivity and sell them on their big markets. And for this reason, he had to flee from the Roman Empire, where most of his teachers were all killed by the Romans, either in conflict or just not conflict, tortured to death, burned to death, crucified, Shimon Bar Yochai hid in the cave with his son until it was safe to come out. And when it was safe, he was too mad for a while. Right? His eyes just shot out fire and destroyed whatever they saw. So they went back in the cave. Eventually, Rabbi Shimon was able to come out in peace, more than even his master, Rabbi Kiva, who entered in peace and left in peace. Rabbi Shimon left in peace and proceeded to integrate with the post-Roman colonial government. His son becomes a cop and detective for the Romans, fully absorbed. And his religion is not so threatening to the Romans somehow. His Kabbalah is somehow not so threatening to Rome, not enough that he ever has to die, but on the contrary, he becomes deeply integrated. His theology becomes deeply integrated. His Torah becomes deeply integrated. It's no longer forbidden within the Roman Empire after the war ends to learn those things and teach those things. On the contrary, Marcus Aurelius or Antigonus of Soho or whoever, Antoninus, I'm sorry, I'm so bad with names of kings because they're all just the same. No, Some kings are special. I remember the names of the special kings, at least the ones who've tried to make it look like they were special or pulled off looking like they were special. And this is the integration of the Gemini, right? Castor dies, Pollux can't die. So Pollux integrates Castor. And in the same way, Samson dies, Samson can't die. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Tzaddik Yisod Olam, his death is Lag BaOmer, and in his death is the celebration of the light that opened up the true mystical secret within the Torah. What is that, you ask? It's elaborate, but also elemental and simple. It's a couple fundamental, simple principles. I want to tell you my simplest, favorite principle from Rabbi Shimon is that the war ends as soon as they don't hate you, and then it's friendship again. And as much as there's motivating factors behind it all, it's motivating factors all the way down. He learns this out. This is the real historical Shimon Bar Yochai, not the mythic one from the Zohar that we don't really know how much is him and how much is someone doing fanfic years later. Really, really good fanfic with the entire true secret nature of the difference between the law as it's understood and the truth as it begs to be understood from within the law. Although that is very true to the character, describes Esav and Yaakov meeting. Why doesn't Esav just kill Yaakov? Why doesn't Yaakov just kill Esav? So some contemporaries of Shimon Bar Yochai, Rish Lakish, says, he tried. Yaakov's neck turned to just brass, and Esav couldn't bite it. In the moment where he embraces him, tries to kill him, just can't physically. It's miracles, Shimon Bar Yochai, who we associate with, the entire esoteric tradition, doesn't say it's miracle. Says, the miracle? Esav hates Yaakov is the law, and Esav breaks that law as soon as he just loves Yaakov. And this is the secret underlying priority in the law. Forgiveness, love, surrender, they all just happen when we feel like they need to happen. And no amount of strategy can quite outsmart that. Because strategy devolves into the ignorance, and this is the first rule of wisdom, is that wisdom stops being wisdom eventually, turns into wealth. And this is where Kabbalah begins in a lot of ways, this integration between the initial just prophetic clarity of liberation and Exodus, the sort of retread over it that becomes the beginning of even beginning to fathom and feel and process and understand what happened. And this is why ER in Taurus is very therapeutic. Just doing a thing is the beginning of therapy. The month of the grasses, the month of healing, 420, And the May Day marches are all very healing. April showers bring May flowers, and the May flowers are the main healing of everything else. But they're still not integrated. Can't live on May flowers, I'm afraid. It's the June bugs that mean you don't have to be in school anymore. They can finally let you go from school because they came to a conclusion about what they were trying to give over. I'm exaggerating, of course, but I think this is just the tendency of just the heat and the cold interplay. And this is our fundamental theory. From extremes come integration, and from integrations come extremes of other unintegrated developments. And this is novelty, and this is Torah, and this is wheat, and this is agriculture, and this is ideology, and this is repression, and this is sublimation, and this is just the great cycle. And I'll prove it in the book next time on Pop Cartoon Kabbalah. La 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 la. I lie 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 la. Ah la la la. Da na 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 da na 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 da na 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 na. Pop Cartoon Kabbalah. Ooh.